It all begins with a door that no one particularly notices, yet everyone has passed by at least once in their life. This door isn't at the entrance of a room or an old building. It doesn't emit light or carry mysterious symbols. In fact, it's often so ordinary that people don't even realize it's a door. Because this door is hidden within a moment. It appears in the midst of daily life. At the moment, a thought is left unfinished. At the moment, a habit is questioned. Many people feel they are reliving the same cycle at a certain point in their lives. The same problems, similar people, recurring disappointments, and constantly postponed potentials. Most interpret this as fate, bad luck, or external circumstances. But modern quantum physics reveals a very fundamental truth. Reality is not a fixed and unchanging structure. It is a field of possibilities constantly reshaped by observation, interaction, and reactions. In other words, life reflects not what happens to you, but how you participate in what happens. And that's where the door appears. However, people often miss this, thinking it's a big event. Yet, the door often opens with a very small difference. Reacting differently to the same situation, noticing an automatic thought for the first time, or inwardly asking, "Do I always have to live like this?" At the quantum level, systems maintain the same pattern up to a certain threshold. But when this threshold is crossed, previously unseen potentials are activated. The same is true in life. Change begins not with a great miracle from the outside, but with a small but clear internal alignment. People often expect help from the outside. They expect someone to come, something to change, conditions to improve. But scientifically, we know that no system produces a different result without a change in its own internal state. Therefore, the concept described as a spiritual guide is not actually a whispering voice from the outside. It is the beginning of the alignment of consciousness with a greater order. When this alignment begins, the person may continue to experience the same events, but they are no longer the same person. And this difference radically changes the reactions to life. Imagine someone waking up one morning as usual. Nothing extraordinary is happening in their life. The same house, the same street, the same responsibilities. But something small happens that day. When faced with a situation that would normally trigger them, they pause for a moment. They breathe before reacting. That's where the door appears. Because from a quantum perspective, that brief gap before reaction is the only place where a new reality can be born. If automaticity continues, the old timeline continues. If awareness enters, a new possibility is activated. This person unconsciously begins to apply a theory: observation instead of reaction. For the first time in their life, they become aware of their own internal state before trying to change what is happening. Scientifically, this means the brain steps out of its usual circuits and the prefrontal cortex is activated. Spiritually, it means shifting to a frequency where guidance can be heard. Because guidance doesn't shout in chaos, it is perceived in calmness. As the days go by, something interesting happens. The same problems still exist, but solutions become more visible. Opportunities previously overlooked become apparent. Boundaries in human relationships are more clearly defined. This is no coincidence. This is the system entering a new alignment. As in quantum systems, when the initial conditions change, so do the results. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" people begin to ask, "What am I choosing in this experience?" This is what opens the door. It's not about everything becoming perfect at once. It's about becoming the subject of one's own experience. Life is no longer something that happens to them, but a process that develops with them. From this point, development is inevitable, because the person has unconsciously invited guidance into their life. Success is no longer just an external goal. It is a natural outcome of inner harmony. Innovation is no longer a daunting unknown. It becomes a realm waiting to be explored. And when the person looks back, they realize the door never closed. It was just invisible until the perspective changed. Life didn't just begin to hear them for the first time. It began to speak the same language as life for the first time. And this language requires neither miracles nor magic. It only requires awareness, consistency, and inner harmony. The door is still there, every day, every moment. The question is not, will it open? The question is, will you notice what's right in front of you? Chapter 2: Quantum Fields and Invisible Support. For many years, humanity defined emptiness as nothingness, the distance between two things, a non-material space, silence. But with quantum field theory, science confronted a shocking truth. What we thought was emptiness was actually a vibrating network of possibilities. Particles were born, disappeared, and reappeared within this field. In other words, the universe was not static. It was like a living system constantly reacting, recording, and interacting. This discovery changed not only physics textbooks, but also the way people perceive themselves. Because if everything is interconnected within this field, human consciousness could not exist outside this network. Thoughts, intentions, emotions. These were not just mental events, but interactions with this field. Experiences described in ancient teachings as guidance, signs, or guiding intuition were actually the natural result of a consciousness synchronized with this field. The person in the story begins to feel a strange but peaceful change in their life after noticing the first door. No longer alone. However, this feeling of not being alone isn't about having someone by your side. Rather, it feels like there's an invisible support in the flow of life. Decisions that were once difficult now seem clearer. It's as if options are spontaneously separating. The right one doesn't shout. It silently reveals itself. From a scientific perspective, this is no coincidence. The quantum field emphasizes possibilities in different ways, depending on the current state of the system. When your inner state changes, from fear to curiosity, from resistance to acceptance, your interaction with the field also changes. The same events, the same people, the same circumstances, but the results are different. Because now you are interacting with the field with a different question. People often describe these moments with phrases like, "Suddenly, I understood. It became clear in an instant. I thought it was a coincidence, but it was very meaningful." However, from a quantum perspective, what is experienced is not a coincidence. It is harmony. The field guides you to specific experiences depending on your current frequency. This guidance isn't like an external push. It's more like an internal pull, like a magnet drawing iron with an invisible force. The person in question experiences an unexpected encounter one day. They wouldn't normally choose that path, but a small inner impulse changes direction, leading them to meet someone who will play a significant role in their life. Previously, they might have called it luck. But now, they realize This encounter is a natural extension of recent inner shifts. Because the field doesn't offer guidance to the unprepared, it only signals to those who are open. In daily life, this invisible support often works not through dramatic events, but through small, critical adjustments. Sending an email the next day instead of that day, postponing a conversation, waiting a little instead of immediately rejecting an opportunity. These small adjustments create chain reactions. In the quantum world, this is called the sensitivity of initial conditions. A small change can transform the entire outcome. When a person begins to recognize this support, the need to control it diminishes, because instead of fighting life, they learn to move with it. This isn't passivity. Rather, it's a much more conscious activity. They no longer try to force everything to happen. They allow the right time, the right context, and the right action to align spontaneously. And interestingly, it is precisely at this point that things begin to fall into place. Long-standing problems are resolved through unexpected conversations. Material or emotional obstacles suddenly disappear, because the person is now acting not only with their own strength, but also with the possibilities offered by the field. The profound truth of this section is, invisible support is not a special gift given to chosen people. This support is open to everyone. What makes the difference is how harmonious the consciousness is. The field doesn't shout. The signs are subtle, silent, and clear. Those who rush miss. Those who are aware grasp. And when a person understands this, they feel a great relief. Life is not against them. The universe is not the enemy of trying. It is simply a constantly interacting field. When you change, the field responds. When you listen, you are guided. When you are ready, the support becomes visible. Chapter 3: The Observer Effect and Internal Direction. When scientists first seriously considered the quantum observer effect, they were actually beginning to question not only the behavior of subatomic particles, but also the very concept we call reality. Experiments repeatedly showed that the moment you try to measure a system, you inevitably change it, and that this change stems not from a flaw in the measuring instrument, but from the way nature works. In other words, there is no completely unbiased, ineffective observer in the universe. This fact is initially unsettling for the person in the story, because it means that the recurring problems in their life may not be solely the fault of external circumstances. The same relationships repeated in different ways, similar financial constraints, the same emotional impasses. Perhaps these are not fate, but a natural consequence of unconsciously focusing on the same point repeatedly. In quantum experiments, the results are shaped by which property of the particle the observer decides to measure. Will it behave like a wave or like a particle? This is already present in the potential of the system. However, its becoming visible depends on the measurement taken. When the person in the story applies this to their own life one morning, they experience a shocking realization. For years, they have been looking at their life with the same question: why is this happening to me again? And life gives the same answer every time. This is precisely where the learning to listen, mentioned in spiritual narratives, gains meaning. Because listening is not waiting for an external voice. Listening is noticing the frequency at which your attention is operating. Inner guidance doesn't work like a mystical entity whispering what to do. It's a much quieter and clearer mechanism. When you consider one option, your heart tightens. When you consider another option, a subtle but real feeling of relief emerges. This feeling is not an emotional whim. It is a bodily and mental harmony. When scientists began to study this at the level of neuroscience and quantum biology, they observed that certain areas of the brain, especially those related to uncertainty and probability assessment, become active at moments of decision. So what we call intuition is not a random feeling. It is a very rapid synthesis of past experiences, environmental signals, and the current situation. From a quantum perspective, this is like a scan that consciousness performs in the realm of possibilities. The person in the story no longer reacts automatically when faced with the same problem. They notice the path they've walked countless times before and stop. This moment of hesitation is crucial because the observer effect comes into play here. When they focus their attention on their old fears, a familiar but narrow reality emerges. When they focus their attention on learning, expanding, and a different possibility, results they've never experienced before emerge. In daily life, this shift isn't experienced as a dramatic enlightenment. It's more like a small but steady change of direction. The person no longer tries to control everything. They choose not to engage in the same arguments. They don't feed the same cycles of self-affirmation. And without realizing it, the quality of the choices life offers them begins to change. Because at the quantum level, the system reinforces the possibilities the observer gravitates towards. This is precisely what inner guidance is. The courage to choose not what frightens you, but is familiar, but what calms you, but is uncertain. This guidance is not verbal. It doesn't tell you, do this. But when you go in the wrong direction, your body tenses, your mind becomes clouded, and an inner tension arises. When you are on the right path, there's a strange sense of clarity, even if the result is not yet visible. Science explains this as the system working with less resistance. Ancient teachings call it flow. The person in the story now understands. Life is not punishing them. The universe is not testing them. They're simply learning where to focus their attention. And with this awareness, they see that many things they thought were fate are actually changeable. Because at the quantum level, fate is not a fixed destiny. It is a recurring form of focus. The deepest truth of this chapter is this: inner guidance does not make you special, but it makes you accountable. Because you now know that what you are looking at is growing. The thought you nurture strengthens, and the attention you choose becomes the life you live. Chapter 4: The Brain, Field, and Intuition. For many years, the human brain was thought of as a complex but closed system that operated solely through chemical reactions and communicated between neurons via electrical signals. However, as neuroscience progressed, it became clear that this organ was not merely an inward-looking processor, but also produced a powerful electrical and electromagnetic field that was constantly interacting with its environment. Studies using measurement techniques such as EEG and MEG have shown that the brain enters into specific synchronization patterns not randomly, but at moments of decision-making, and that different brain regions begin to align at the same frequency, especially during intuitive decisions. At this point, the man who is the protagonist of our story, an ordinary man leading an ordinary life, neither a scientist nor a mystical seeker, recalls that feeling of momentary hesitation that he has carried within him for years but could never quite define. There were times in his life when he experienced that quiet inner signal that inexplicably steered him away from the wrong path, or, conversely, encouraged him and guided him towards the right step. These moments have one thing in common. The calmer his mind, the clearer this feeling becomes. This is where science comes in. Research shows that when the brain is constantly stimulated, when it is hasty and scattered, the neural networks enter a chaotic frequency distribution. In this state, decisions are often shaped by fear, habit, or external pressures. However, when a person consciously or unconsciously slows down, takes a deep breath, pauses for a few seconds, reduces the internal noise, the brain waves shift to a more harmonious structure. The state described in spiritual narratives as inner calm is actually the brain entering this synchronized state. The miraculous moment in the story occurs in precisely such a situation. Adam is about to make perhaps one of the most critical decisions of his life. He has a long-awaited job offer. Everything looked perfect on paper, but the unease within him wouldn't subside. Just as he was about to sign the contract, he strangely stopped. He put his phone in his pocket, walked out of the building without speaking to anyone, sat on a nearby bench, and for the first time, truly stopped. He thought neither positively nor negatively. He simply waited. In those few minutes of silence, the turmoil in his mind slowly dissipated, giving way to a very simple realization. I don't want this life. This sentence came not with an outburst of emotion, but with almost mathematical clarity. There was no panic, no excitement, just a profound calm. What he would later learn was this. At that moment, a high level of synchronization occurred between different regions of his brain. In other words, what we call intuition is not a mysterious miracle, but the quietest form of knowledge. The man rejected the offer. From the outside, it seemed like an irrational risk. But months later, he takes a completely different path in a field he had never considered before and finds a far more fulfilling job, both mentally and emotionally. Looking back, he realizes the luckiest decision of his life was made in the quietest moment. The miracle in this story is not an event that defies the rules of the universe. The miracle is that at a moment when the brain is silent, a person can truly access their own inner data. Because intuition is not a voice from the outside. It is information that already exists within us and finally becomes audible. In daily life, this awareness creates significant transformations. As people move away from hasty decisions, regrets decrease. The constantly asked question, "Did I make a mistake?" is replaced by the feeling, "I made the clearest decision I could at that moment." The guidance here is not a prophecy preparing you for the future. It is the ability to align with the present moment. Scientifically speaking, the more organized the brain region is, the clearer the interaction with environmental signals becomes. What ancient teachings called alignment with the field is called synchronization in modern neuroscience. The names change, but the mechanism remains the same. And perhaps the quietest but most powerful truth of this aspect is this. Intuition doesn't shout. It doesn't try to persuade. It simply reveals itself at the right moment, at the right frequency, to those who are ready. Chapter 5. Synchronization. What you think is coincidence. The human mind dislikes uncertainty. Therefore, it dismisses encounters it cannot make sense of, timings it cannot explain, and illogical coincidences with a single word, coincidence. But when Carl Jung, in the early 20th century, realized that some events intersected without a causal link, yet with a deep and meaningful connection, he felt this was far more than mere chance. This concept, which Jung called synchronization, remained within the confines of psychology for a long time until modern science began to study the behavior of complex systems. In the quantum age, and with the development of systems theories, we now know that seemingly independent processes can align simultaneously in an invisible context. Chaos theory, network systems, and probability distributions show that small changes in large systems lead to meaningful intersections at certain thresholds. Often, at these threshold moments, experiences occur that are referred to as signs in spiritual narratives. In this part of our story, the man we met in previous chapters is going through one of the most fragile periods of his life. There's been months of uncertainty, a series of small disappointments, and a growing sense of resignation. One evening, out for a short walk with no expectations, he enters a street he hasn't seen in years. He doesn't know why he's going there. On that street, a small shop with old books in its window catches his attention. It's a place he wouldn't normally stop to look, but that day, his steps slow. When he enters, a book on one of the shelves catches his eye. The title of the book is almost identical to a question that has been swirling in his mind for weeks. This is one of those moments when many people say, "This is a sign." But what's important here isn't the book being there. It's the man's mental state at that moment. Scientifically, selective attention and networks of meaning lie behind such experiences. When the human brain focuses intensely on a particular subject, it filters peripheral information differently. Things it has overlooked thousands of times before become invisible, while meaningful stimuli suddenly come to the forefront. What Jung intuitively realized is also supported by cognitive science and systems theories. Synchronization isn't about the events themselves, but about how you connect with those events. A man picks up a book, goes home, and while reading it, realizes this. The book doesn't tell him what to do. It doesn't offer a life-changing prophecy. It simply makes visible an already existing, repressed aspect of himself. A week later, this awareness leads him to a meeting he had previously dared not attend. The person he meets at that meeting becomes a key figure in changing the course of his life in the months that follow. Looking back, people say, "How lucky you were." But he feels this way. He wasn't lucky. He was prepared. This is precisely the most critical point of synchronization. The signs don't push you away. They don't break down the door. They only become visible when they align with you. For an unprepared person, that book is an ordinary book. That street is an ordinary street. That encounter is meaningless. But for someone approaching an inner threshold, the same event takes on a completely different meaning. The idea of help arriving just in time, often emphasized in narratives of spiritual guidance, can be interpreted here not as a mystical intervention, but as systems entering a moment of alignment. When you change, the frequency of your attention changes. When your attention shifts, the possibilities you perceive change. And this shift creates an effect that elicits a feeling of help has arrived in the outside world. People who experience synchronicity in their daily lives often say, "It happened just when I was about to give up." This sentence describes not a coincidental timing, but an internal threshold moment. Because reaching the point of giving up is usually the moment when old thought patterns dissolve, mental noise subsides, and a new order is ready to form. Science is cautious at this point because synchronicity is difficult to measure directly. But its immeasurability does not mean it does not exist. Just as critical thresholds in a system can only be understood through results. And perhaps the most important point of this section is this: synchronity does nothing to you. It gives you nothing. It only makes an already existing path visible for a brief moment. The door is there. Help doesn't force anything. Those who notice enter. Chapter 6. Help begins when you let go of control. When faced with uncertainty, the human mind reflexively turns to control. Control is one of the oldest defense mechanisms against the unknown and provides a short-lived sense of security. However, both modern psychology and quantum physics give us a quiet but clear warning. Over-control doesn't stabilize the system, it locks it down. Experiments with quantum systems have shown that when you constantly measure a particle's state and try to hold it at a specific point, the system's natural evolutionary process is disrupted, and the expected transitions don't occur. This is known as the quantum Zeno effect, inspired by the metaphor of a constantly monitored system being unable to move. While the particle theoretically has many possible states, it can't go anywhere when constantly interfered with. For scientists, this is a physical fact. However, its counterpart in human life often goes unnoticed. The person at the center of our story has long been trying to manage their life in the right way. Correct decisions, correct timing, correct plans. Everything has been mentally checked repeatedly, potential risks calculated, and margins of error minimized. From the outside, they appear disciplined, intelligent, and meticulous. However, deep down, there is a growing weariness. Because controlling everything also means taking sole responsibility for everything. One day, they experience a small but very important moment. A planned meeting is canceled at the last minute. Normally, this would anger them, force them to reschedule, and they would try to forcefully complete the missing piece. But this time, for the first time, they strangely stop. They don't think about what needs to be done. They don't analyze what went wrong. They just remain in that void. From a scientific perspective, these are moments when the brain's control centers briefly retreat and default mode networks are activated. Neuroscience studies show that a person's creative insights and intuitive awareness emerge precisely during these moments when compulsive thinking stops. When the brain is constantly working towards a goal, it's like a closed circuit. When it stops, it begins to form new connections. That day, the person goes for an unplanned walk. They have no specific purpose. They simply move. This is where the difference between letting go of control and surrendering becomes apparent. Surrendering is not giving up. It's not completely letting go of the steering wheel. Surrendering is withdrawing from the effort to forcibly control every micro moment. The phrase, "help came at that moment," often used in narratives of spiritual guidance, is frequently misunderstood. Help isn't a dramatic intervention from the outside. Rather, it's the moment when already existing options become clear for the first time. During the journey, the person considers an idea they've rejected countless times before. They can't remember why they rejected it. They simply realize the idea feels strangely light. This moment is similar to the energy minimum in quantum systems. The system becomes stable when it reaches a state of least resistance. In human life, this manifests as the emergence of an internally non-challenging option. Help begins here because consciousness has now ceased generating resistance. A small step taken the next day becomes the beginning of a process that will change the direction of their lives months later. Looking back, they realize nothing happened magically. No one came to rescue them. But for the first time, because they weren't trying to create events themselves, they could see what was happening. The quantum gate metaphor makes sense here. This gate is a threshold that closes when forced and opens when attuned. When the mind constantly controls, it narrows the possibilities. When control loosens, the system breathes, and breathing systems produce new patterns. This is extremely concrete in everyday life. People often say, "When I let go, it came." This sentence is an expression of conscious relaxation, not fatalistic surrender. Because letting go is not being indifferent. Letting go is giving up the effort to predetermine every outcome. Science is silent on this, but it is clear. Complex systems evolve within flexible limits, not under rigid control. Humans are also a system biologically, neurologically, and psychologically. The same rules apply here. And perhaps the most striking truth of this chapter is this: help doesn't come when you're strong enough. Help becomes visible when you stop forcing it. Because the quantum gateway opens not through willpower, but through awareness and harmony. Chapter 7: How Spiritual Guidance Changes Life. When most people talk about spiritual guidance, they imagine grand scenes where everything changes suddenly, a dramatic turning point occurs, or life evolves in a completely different direction overnight. However, true guidance works through almost imperceptible but irreversible changes, and that's precisely why its effect is lasting. From a quantum perspective, this process is more like a quiet rebalancing of probabilities than a miraculous leap. When the person in the story becomes aware of the concept of guidance, the external circumstances of their life haven't yet changed. They live in the same city, work the same job, and meet the same people. But internally, something very subtle has changed. Situations that used to consume them no longer have the same effect. Conversations, glances, or uncertainties that used to occupy their minds for hours now disappear or quickly lose their significance. From the outside, this might be interpreted as maturation. However, scientifically, the brain's perception of threat and stress responses have been recalibrated. Neuroscience research shows that the constant repetition of the same emotional cycles is not fate, but the result of repetitive neural pathways. What we call guidance begins with recognizing these patterns and ceasing to automatically feed them. A person doesn't suddenly start doing everything right. They simply stop doing what's wrong for as long as they did before. In daily life, this manifests as drawing boundaries sooner. Relationships previously maintained with excuses like, "It would be embarrassing," "It might be misunderstood," or "Maybe things will work out," are now clarified more quickly. In quantum terms, this means that incompatible possibilities lose energy. Because when attention and emotional investment are withdrawn, that timeline is not fed. One day, a person realizes they've fallen into a trap they've fallen into repeatedly in the past, but this time, much sooner. The same phrases, the same behaviors, the same ambiguities. But this time, there's a quiet clarity, not an alarm. No big outburst of anger or dramatic breakup, just withdrawal. The power of guidance lies precisely here. It doesn't create noise. From a quantum perspective, a shift in the timeline isn't about instantly leaping into another universe. It's about determining which possibility gains strength through small choices made at each moment. The person receiving guidance doesn't apply this as a conscious technique. Rather, they begin to feel dissonance more quickly, both physically and mentally. This feeling isn't fear. It's more like realizing there's nothing left to carry. Scientifically, this is related to a shift in the balance between the brain's reward and stress systems. The person no longer perceives familiar chaos as safe. The brain begins to reward consistency, not drama. While this change may seem miraculous from the outside, internally, it's a slow and steady restructuring. Guidance doesn't make the person encounter fewer problems. Life is still uncertain, challenging, and sometimes painful. But the difference is this: problems no longer define the person's identity. The question, "Why does this always happen to me?" is no longer relevant. It's replaced by, "What does this show me?" This isn't a spiritual escape, it's a cognitive evolution. After a while, the person realizes this. Life isn't perfect, but it's more meaningful. Because experiences begin to feel like a readable language, not random chaos. Guidance doesn't tell you what to do. It helps you feel which path to follow to be yourself. This feeling is the most reliable compass. And perhaps the quietest but deepest change is this: the person fights less with themselves. The constant thought of, "I should have been someone else," weakens. At the quantum level, this is like the system approaching its own natural frequency. When resistance decreases, energy flows more efficiently. In conclusion, guidance doesn't make life perfect. Mistakes still happen. Missteps are still taken. But these mistakes no longer shatter a person, because guidance reorganizes the inner balance, not the outer world. A person whose inner balance changes inevitably experiences a change in their life as well. That's why guidance works not with great miracles, but with a quiet but irreversible opening. And one day, when a person looks back, they realize, life hasn't changed, but now I look at it from a different perspective. Chapter 8: The Ultimate Truth. You understand. When the door opens, when the story ends, it's not really an end, but a point where perspective shifts irrevocably. Because the person begins to realize that what they have long called help is not an external intervention, but a state of preparation, silently maturing internally. When the door opens, there is no expected burst of light, sound, or dramatic sign. The environment is the same. Life is the same. But the person looking is no longer the same. This realization usually comes not with a grand moment, but in the middle of a very ordinary day. The person encounters a situation that used to cause panic and notices that the old tension in their body is gone. The familiar confusion in their mind doesn't rise. It is at that moment that they understand the door opens not in the external world, but in perception. The truth that quantum physics has been articulating for years, but which is difficult to perceive in daily life, becomes silently visible here. When the observer changes, the experienced reality also changes. At this point, what is called spiritual guidance ceases to be a mysterious concept. The individual realizes that guidance is not instructions whispered from an entity. It becomes clear that consciousness has the capacity to adapt to a larger order. Just as quantum systems shift to different modes of behavior under specific conditions, human consciousness also changes its relationship with life when it surpasses a certain threshold of awareness. Quantum field theory tells us that particles are not independent actors within the field. They are constantly interacting with the field. The same is true for humans. When a person perceives themselves as an isolated self, conflict with life becomes inevitable. However, when a person begins to perceive themselves as part of a larger process, a sense of help naturally arises. This help isn't about things being done for you. It's about the ability to recognize the right thing at the right time. Looking back, the person in the story realizes that there have always been lucky moments, coincidences, or last-minute solutions in their life. The only thing that changes is that they have reached a level of consciousness where they can perceive them. Neuroscientifically, this corresponds to a state where the brain shifts from a threat-focused scanning mode to a mode of perceiving meaning and patterns. In other words, the person has begun to see not only danger, but also opportunity. The door metaphor gains meaning here. When the door opens, no one enters as expected, because the door is not a threshold separating the inside from the outside. The door represents a transition from a narrow understanding of identity to a broader awareness. The person no longer defines themselves solely by their past, fears, and habits. This separation is not an escape. On the contrary, it is a more real state of contact. In daily life, this awareness produces very concrete results. The person sees that not everything is a personal test. Some things happen because they are. Some doors close because there is no longer growth there. This acceptance is not passivity. It is the redirection of energy to the right place. At the quantum level, this means less friction in the realm of probability. At a certain point, the person begins to feel that life flows with them, not against them. This feeling stems not from an increasing sense of control, but from a decreasing need for control. Because the person understands that they cannot manage everything, but they can consciously participate in everything. This aligns with what modern science calls complex systems. Systems lock up when challenged and produce order when they adapt. And perhaps the quietest but most powerful truth of the story is revealed here. Help never came into being out of nothing. Guidance wasn't a savior waiting to be called upon. Everything was already there. It was simply a matter of reaching the necessary frequency to perceive it. This frequency isn't about being perfect, knowing everything, or being fearless. Rather, it's about accepting one's own limitations. A mind that accepts what it doesn't know can receive new information. A consciousness that accepts what it cannot control can adapt to the flow. The story doesn't end here. Because this isn't an end, it's a threshold. When the door opens, the person understands. They no longer need to wait for a miracle. Because viewed from the right perspective, life itself is already alive, guiding, and meaningful enough. And the person quietly thinks to themselves, "Help was always here. Now I am in a place where I can hear it."